The book was sort of a labor of love. I was approached 5 years ago by the History Press. They have a number of titles in this series that they're doing of beer books around the country. And they harassed me for 5 years. I kept telling them I had no time to do this. They kept saying, you know, we'll find you a co-author a year ago. And I said if they wanted it that bad, we would do it. So I got a co-author. His name is Adam Krakowski. He is an honest-to-God historian. And he decided to do the first half of this story, which was from colonial times until Vermonters embraced Prohibition, which was a whole lot earlier than a lot of people. I think Maine was the only place that did it earlier than Vermont. And the story is that you know, we had a number of breweries, and you know, it's sort of interesting. We've come full circle in a lot of ways. The first brewery to essentially raise funds to create a brewery was done in Wethersfield, Vermont, and it essentially was the state gave this guy permission to hold a lottery in order to raise the funds to create this brewery, and it sounds an awful lot like a Kickstarter campaign to me. You know, it's you know, we've come full circle at this point where people are essentially raising money through the generosity of strangers, and then they get a little piece of the action afterwards. So a couple of things happened here in Vermont. One of the things is because of our agriculture history, we were able to cultivate hops, and we were the second largest by the turn of the century. By 1900, we were the second largest producer of hops. And this is pretty good for a state that was essentially practicing prohibition at the time, and temperance. But it's funny, you look in some of the records of the various towns around Vermont, and school would start, you know, right after Labor Day, and the kids would all go to school, and then school would be called off. And essentially it was called off in order for the hops harvest to happen, which is a very labor intensive. If you guys have done your own hops, you know, picking those little cones is a little labor intensive. So every community would get into it. Your kids, child labor laws were broken on a routine basis. And the result was boxcars full of hops would leave Vermont to be brewed, you know, in New York, Boston, Philadelphia. The only place that was making more hops was New York, and that, you know, just due to the sheer size of the state. It's funny, Adam, when he got interested in the hops cultivation in Vermont, one of the things he was doing was working in his master's degree in history here in Vermont and UVM. One of the things he was asked to do was to run around the state and look at old farming structures. And one of the things that he kept finding over and over again were these buildings that he had no explanation for. And one of the things that these buildings turned out to be used for was to dry hops. You know, they would take the vines and would dry the cones inside these buildings, which were these essentially narrow, tall buildings. And there are a few of these buildings that still exist today. Adam really is the guy to talk about the ancient history, but by the 1850s, the Vermont legislature was yearly deciding whether or not there was going to be prohibition. So one year they would do it, and then the next year it wouldn't happen, then it would get put in permanently. And from what Adam says in the book, this was the death of the Whigs here in Vermont. That was the last time the Whigs would ever run the show here in Vermont, was after they permanently instituted prohibition. So if you were a brewer in Vermont in the 1850s, you couldn't sell your beer locally anymore. So anybody that was still making beer, you know, we've got a long tradition of, you know, supporting our businesses in the state. They didn't make these businesses go out of business, but you couldn't sell your beer to Vermonters. And so the beer was, in a lot of these bottles that you look at, labeled for export only. So beer that was made either in Burlington or down in Bellows Falls or across the river in Walpole, New Hampshire, These beers were essentially sold out of state. There were a number of licensing agreements where beer produced in Vermont would bear the Pabst label, for example. So, I mean, there was a lot going on as far as beer production, but it essentially comes to a screaming halt in the 1870s, which is where Vermont essentially last brewery closes in the state. Now, there's 100 years space. During that 100 years, no beer is made in the state. I mean, people are still drinking some beer, but Vermonters never really had a tradition of drinking or making beer in Vermont. If you look at Corin Hirsch just did a wonderful book about the cocktails here in colonial times. And one of the things that you'll find is a lot of apple cider was drank, a lot of rum was drank, but there really wasn't a tradition here in Vermont of beer making. And so we embraced Prohibition and the temperance movement in the 1850s. By the 1870s, we're done making beer. And then 100 years later, you have the likes of this is kind of interesting because, you look at a lot of these places where you had the temperance movement through the 1920s. And, during that period of time, the brewers were still making malt, malted milks. The brewers were still, the art still existed in places like Boston and Philadelphia, in New York. The brewers marked their time between the beginning and end of Prohibition, and essentially the continuation of the tradition of beer making, and the skills remained in those places. But Vermont, it was long gone. So by the 1970s, you have these home brewers that are set loose because of President Jimmy Carter changing the law and allowing for home brewing. And when that window was open just a crack, people realized that there really wasn't a whole lot of information about home brewing. The kits that could be purchased were all from England, which if you look at the craft brewing movement right now today, you'll see that a lot of these craft breweries are dominated by pale ales, Indian pale ales. I mean, you can't be a craft brewery now without an Indian pale ale. And stouts, English bitters. These are the kinds of kits that were coming to the United States from various kit makers in England. So that was the only way that you were going to get the ingredients to be able to make these beers. So in Vermont, you had Steve Mason of Catamount, who goes to England. He interns at a brewery, comes back with the skills he needs, and starts to raise the money. It takes him a while to raise the money. By 1987, he has raised the money, he's opened the brewery, and for the first time in over 100 years, beer is made in the state of Vermont in White River Junction. It's sort of interesting, just up the road from Wethersfield, Vermont, where the first brewery in the state was made in the colonial times, that White River Junction. Why Windsor County? That's a big question. And to this day, you've got the old Catamount Brewery now is owned by Harpoon. You've got the Long Trail Brewery in Bridgewater Corners. And we're making so much beer in Windsor County. It's just a fluke, whether it's the water, whether it's the fact that these people decided to use these the old corridors. The intersection of 89 and 91. It was the same as the railroads all intersecting in White River Junction. Who knows what magnet it is that causes that to happen. Okay, so now you've got Greg Noonan, who and his wife Nancy, who are down in Massachusetts. He grew up in East Longmeadow, or Longmeadow, Massachusetts, and the two of them have become interested in home brewing. He's been brewing for a while now, and he decides that he wants to open up a brew pub. There are no other brew pubs in the state, in the East Coast at this point. So essentially, he's looking around at Northampton, Massachusetts, and just as he's found a place where he wants to do it, he finds out there's a brother and sister team that are already ahead of him and they are the ones that create the Northampton Brewery. So instead of trying to create a second brewery in the same town, they begin to look for towns in New England to possibly create a brewery, and Burlington, Vermont is the lucky recipient of the second brewery on the East Coast after the craft brewing movement starts, with the Vermont Pub and Brewery. Still in its original location. If you guys have ever had the pleasure of going down inside that brew house and seeing what Greg Noonan has been able over the years to sandwich into that space, it is a testament to Yankee ingenuity. And this is something that is a hallmark of the Vermont brewing scene. We've been able to use old milk tanks from failed dairy farms. You go into any of these breweries and you'll see things cobbled together, old sugaring tanks. It's wonderful to see this stuff. Plus there's a lot of good new stainless as well. So as far as what went on, we got Catamount and Vermont Pub and Brewery that start up. Quickly on their heels, you see Lawrence Miller at Otter Creek and Andy Pearson at Long Trail, which was Mountain Brewers back then. And the interesting thing of those two is they come at it from a different point of view. Lawrence Miller spends some time in Germany and learns about Dusseldorf Alts, and as a result, Copper Ale and Andy Pearson essentially spent some time learning about German beers as well, and he also decides that Long Trail Ale is going to be something other than a British style ale. And so in Vermont we have these two parallel movements going on. We've got a lot of interest in German styles, we've got a lot of interest in the British styles. And as these different breweries spring up, you have, for example, all of these guys came from a tradition of home brewing for the most part. The first guy that would come at this from a professional standpoint would be Ray McNeil in Brattleboro. And Ray McNeil owned a pub in Brattleboro called Three Penny Deweys, and he goes in to see Steve Mason up at Catamount, and he says, "I'm your biggest account down in Brattleboro, Vermont, and you're going to teach me how to brew beer." So they put him in the intern program, and he is the first brewer that opens up a brewery from a professional background as opposed to a home brewing background. The Latches was another one. You know, it's really funny. I mean, you can see over the course of time the various breweries that have opened and closed. We've had some award-winning breweries all across the state. Cross Brewing in Morrisville, for example, won a gold medal at the World Beer Cup for a Belgian-style ale. This was the first time we were seeing Belgian-style ales being made here in the United States. But once again, you know, production problems. You know, it's really funny. You look, one of the things that came really crystal clear in doing this book was, you know, how can these brewers that are making phenomenal beer, how can they fail? You know, what causes a brewery to fail? Well, for Cross, you know, they were making this absolutely delicious stuff. Their bottles had this nasty habit of exploding on the shelf. Okay, this was not something that retailers were willing to put up with. So as time went on, you see two reasons for various breweries to fail. Either they were making crappy beer, or they come into it so undercapitalized, which is probably one of the issues that you guys are going to face as you guys move forward on this concept. If you come into it undercapitalized, you'll last probably 5 years before you decide to pull the plug on it, that it just becomes a money pit. One of the exciting things that are happening now is here in Vermont, you know, you're wondering why we've become this mecca for beer, and part of the reason is that here we've had a very mature local vor movement, and what happened here in Vermont was that when Steve Mason or Greg Noonan decided to start making beer, Vermonters were ready to buy Vermont-made beer. I mean, it was something that's part of our DNA here, that we support the local farmers, we support local ice cream makers or coffee roasters, whatever. We're ready to support those kind of people if they're willing to make something for us to drink or eat. And so the idea of a farmer's market is something that that is not the new chic thing to do for Vermonters. I mean, we've been doing this forever. So as Vermont has become, when I'm asked this in various interviews, one of the things that people ask is like, you know, why is Vermont so different? Well, I think that as Vermont tries to find our niche in the global marketplace, one of the things that I think that we've been very successful at doing is building on our reputation for purity and being a place where good things to eat and drink come from. And I tell everybody that's willing to listen that Vermont is the American Bavaria. We are going to be, our niche in the marketplace is going to be the place where good things to eat and drink come from. And this is happening in a lot of ways here in Vermont with the cider makers. It's happening as well with the beer makers. And the number of styles, the number of different focuses from the breweries. And, you know, one of the things that's sort of interesting as far as our commitment to the local beer is that I go to the Craft Brewers Conference wherever it's held each year, and I talk to people who do my job as executive director of the Vermont Brewers Association for Colorado, Nevada, all these other states. And every one of them is just absolutely jealous of the fact that Vermont, you know, where the craft beer scene on a whole is 10% of the market, here in Vermont, we're more than 20% of the package store sales. So, you know, almost double what the national market is. And even more amazing is the fact that we're 50% of the tap handles. So you go into any bar in Vermont, more likely than not, you're going to find a Vermont beer for sale. That's unheard of in a lot of places in the country. So I think the last thing that I want to say is that people are always asking as to whether or not we're done. You know, have we reached the critical mass here in Vermont? Is there room for any more breweries? I think there is. And I think there will be well into the future. I think that once again, you talk about if a company comes into it, if you're a really bad business person, you're going to fail at business. And it doesn't matter whether you're making beer or widgets. So if you're making the best beer on the planet and your ambition is to dominate the world's beer market, that's going to be a tough road to hoe. Otherwise, if you walk into it, the brewery that I think about a lot when I talk about this is Stone Corral over in Huntington. Guy's name is Brett Hamilton, and he's got a system a little bit bigger than this. And all his ambition is he wants to be the brewer for Huntington, Vermont, you know, which is population 300 or something, you know. So if that's his ambition, he'll do just fine. He's not going to quit his day job, okay? It's these folks that go in over their head that have invested in a lot of stainless, and, you know, the craft beer market is getting crowded. I just went into a store over in Williston, and I'm going to say that 80% of the beers in that store were from out of state, all highly prized craft beers. But the Vermont beers only had a little small section in that store. I think that they're missing the boat on, you know, our dominance of the marketplace, but that's for them to figure out over the course of time. You know, I could talk forever about my excitement and enthusiasm for Vermont beer, but really what I like to do is just drink it.